Hello, I want to thank you for watching. And we are not in the barn, so I cannot call this another study from the barn, as we are actually at my son Eli's and Laura's house. And so this is the opportunity, though, that I had to record this lesson. And I'm Dennis Tucker, and I appreciate you watching. I preach for the Lilac Road Church of Christ in Litchfield, Kentucky. If you can and have the opportunity to come be with us, feel free to do so. Our building is located at 1687 Lilac Road, Litchfield, Kentucky. And our time of services on Sunday morning, we have Bible class at 9:30, and then worship is at 10:25. On Wednesday night, we have Bible classes at 7 p.m. But I thought it'd be a good time to give a lesson. And I've been preaching on Lilac Road long enough now that this is the second presidential election that I've been preaching. Well, we had since I've been preaching on Lilac Road. And if you're like me, you'll be glad when this election is over with. We have been inundated with commercials on the radio and on television that's telling us who to vote for and why. Sometimes they're negative ads pointing out the faults of the other person. Sometimes they're the ads is extolling the virtues of the person that is providing for this ad. And eventually we kind of like, okay, we can kind of recite the commercials by memory, that we know what this person here, what they did, where they're from, and we know what the other person, all the bad things about them, and then we can reverse it for the other person, and we know all the things they've done. And so we'll be glad when this election is over with. On Tuesday night, and probably because it's 2020 and the days ahead, it's going to be not on Tuesday night because probably the election won't be called then because of all the mail-in ballots and different kind of voting going on. So there's going to be a lot of anxiety. There'll be people huddled around their televisions watching, and people and that's really anxious to find out who's going to win this, and nervousness and until the winner is declared. And then at that point, there'll be probably some people that'll be crying and some people that will be celebrating. And that's because politics and government can be very polarizing. People normally get along. I always think about the fact that Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart were really good friends in Hollywood and big actors, but the one area that they could not agree with, they could not talk about, and they had to agree to not really talk about this to each other, was about politics. They just could not get along in that area. And there's a lot of people I know that's like that. And as I was thinking about this election, I think we need to look at this from the right perspective. And so what I'm going to do in this lesson is talk about some things that deals with politics and our attitude about the government and our responsibilities towards God. But on one occasion, Jesus was asked a question about paying taxes. Over in Matthew 22nd chapter, verse 15, it said, Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person or of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness, said, Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Now notice here that it says they entangled him, or were plotting to entangle him, and Jesus acknowledged the fact that they were trying to test him, and they may think, why was this such a difficult question? Why was this such a hard question? Really, as you think about it, you have two groups, though. The Pharisees is mentioned here specifically, and the Pharisees was against the very idea of paying taxes to a foreign government. In the Old Testament, we find that God punished Israel many times when they turned to foreign governments for aid, or when that God wanted them to rely solely upon Him as their protector. And so some of the Pharisees may have looked at this and think, why are we paying to this foreign government? God's not going to bless as long as we're doing that. And then on the other side, you have the Herodians. And the Herodians were kind of like more of the modernist type of Jews, more of the let's get along kind of Jews. And the Herodians pay taxes to Caesar. And so they didn't have a problem with that. They worked with the Roman government. And so you had two factions here. You had the one that says we can't have anything to do with the Roman government. And then you had the other one that says, well, we can work with the Roman government. And as you look at that, the coin itself had an inscription of Caesar on the coin. That's why when Jesus says, show me the coin. And the inscription of Caesar was for a purpose, and that is Caesar was seen as being a god. That in the book of Revelation, a little while after the death of Jesus, we read about in history the idea of emperor worship, of Caesar worship, where literally they would bow down to this image of Caesar and pray to him and pay taxes to him. And so they saw this also as idolatry, a form of idolatry here. And then finally, the disciples, as you look at this, you had to think, well, the disciples had to wonder, how's Jesus going to answer this question? How's their master teacher going to answer this question? Have you ever been in that situation where somebody would ask a question and you're glad it's not directed at you? You're glad that's directed to the other person because you're really curious about how's this other person going to answer the question. And I can just see his disciples kind of being that way right here. It's kind of like, okay, let's listen up and see what our master teacher says. And so verse 19, we go on, and it says, Jesus said, and he says, show me the tax money. And this, so they brought him denarius, and he said, now whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar things are Caesar's, and the God of things are God's. And so the question Jesus asked was a very simple question, a very obvious question, actually, of, okay, whose inscription is on the coin? And they knew the coin was a Roman coin, and they used the Roman coin to buy and sell. It was the coin they normally use in their everyday activities when they would go to the market and buy things, when they paid, their neighbor for rent or whatever it was. That was the coin in circulation. And that's why when you go and read about the money changers at the temple, that the Jews had their coin, that's true, but it was mainly a coin used for religious purposes, for going to the temple. And so the everyday coin they used was this coin of Caesar on it. And so what he's doing is he looks at the coin and says, well, that's Roman coin. And in essence, Rome has the right to ask for the coin back. If they want to be paid in their coin, then you pay in their coin. And that's what they're doing. But the last part says, but render to God the things that are God's. And so we're going to spend the rest of this lesson thinking, okay, what does the Caesars do? And then the third part of what does God do? And so Caesar, as you look at this here, what we see is our responsibility to the government. One is to pay taxes. That's what this question is all about, right? And so we think about, we pay taxes whether we like Caesar, and that is the government, or whether we deny the government. Again, I know sometimes a group will say, well, we're not going to pay taxes because we don't agree with how our government is spending our money. Maybe we don't like the fact that we're spending so much on the military, or we don't like so much that our government is spending money on helping poor people, or we don't like the fact that our government is spending on different programs we may be totally opposed to. Keep in mind here, Caesar, the government at this time, that army, that government is going to actually kill Jesus. They're going to crucify him on the cross. And eventually that government is going to destroy Jerusalem. It wasn't a case where they were paying taxes because they agreed with everything Caesar was doing. And he's simply pointing out here, like today, we pay taxes whether or not we agree with everything the government is doing or not. And when you think about Caesar, again, their government, their Caesar was not term limited. Their Caesar was not somebody that would be here for 4 years, and 4 years later he may be replaced by another Caesar by term. Now, again, sometimes that happened because of rebellion, because of people killing Caesar, something along that lines. But their Caesars a lot of times served for many years. Their government officials served many years. And so even if they did not like the programs of Caesar, he's saying that in essence that you pay your taxes. And this gets a very basic principle, and that is, in order for a government of man to work, there has to be some form of taxation. When you look back at 1 Samuel 8th chapter, and that chapter was when the children of Israel comes to the prophet, or comes to Eli and asks for a king. And it's pointing out to them that they had rejected God. Now, they was wrong in doing that, but also point out to them that if you ask for a king, I tell you what's going to happen. He's going to start taxing you. He describes that he's going to start asking for your men, for your women to be servants of his. He's going to tax you in order to provide for the things that he needs. And that's true today, that whenever a government does something, the fact is that costs money, and the government must receive money to pay for those things. And so we look at this and realize nobody likes paying taxes to the government. And in fact, you go a little bit later on in 1 Samuel 17th chapter, was with David and Goliath. And this was when Goliath was challenging the children of Israel to come out, send out your best warrior, and we'll fight. And David, and nobody did that. David asked the question, what would be done for the man that goes out there and fights Goliath? Well, there's a number of things that was said that he would receive if he was victorious. And one of those was he would not have to pay taxes. And I always found that just interesting, in fact, that they saw that as a great benefit, not having to pay taxes. But the fact is that we do because our government provides services. One of the things that with surveys, sometimes they'll do a survey about, do you think the government should provide this? And maybe it is on the line. So do you think the government should provide internet service to everybody? Do you think the government should provide, and they'll have some other kind of program. And invariably the response comes back as a lot of people say, yes, I want my government to provide that. Well, really a better question is, are you willing to pay for the government to provide for these things? Am I willing to pay higher taxes to have the government provide for me my service, whatever the service may be, whether it's the internet or whether it's healthcare or whether it's something else? Because that really is what it comes down to. We're not to pay for what the government does. And so we look in in Romans 13 chapter then. Let's turn our attention to that passage as we study this here. Because the Apostle Paul writing in verse 1 in Romans 13 chapter says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, and avenger is to keep wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's minister, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, tax to whom taxes due, custom to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And so he says in verse 6 here, here's the royal government. And the royal government is that they are God's ministers to do this thing, to do the good things that he just described earlier. He said, because of this, then you pay taxes. And he did mention their kind of taxes. That is taxes and taxes, but customs and customs. They had different taxes like today. We pay income tax, we pay Social Security tax, we pay sales tax, we pay maybe property tax, and there's all kinds of different taxes we pay. And so he says, okay, you are to pay your taxes because the government is providing you a service. And we realize that in essence, there are things the government does do that we as individuals cannot do. I cannot build an interstate. I cannot build a water supply system or anything on that lines that our civil or local governments provide services that we cannot do. And so it's right that we pay taxes for those things. So he says, first of all, we are to pay taxes to our government. And then the second thing he says also is to honor and respect our government. In 1 Peter 2, verse 17. In 1 Peter 2, verse 17 says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Now, honor the king does not necessarily mean I approve of their personality or I approve of their lifestyle, but what he's talking about is the position that they hold. And in particular, and again, I think good illustration of this in the Old Testament was David with King Saul. King Saul's trying to kill David. If you go back and read through 1 Samuel, after chapter 17, we find that Saul becomes very zealous of David, and I think it's the same word, but it's David. And what we find is that David has the opportunity twice actually to kill Saul. But he does not do that because Saul was God's anointed. Saul has a position of authority that God had given to him. And so there's a distinction made in David's mind between the individual and the position that he is holding. And same thing for us today, that we understand the office of the president, the office of governor, the office of whatever, the mayor, that not necessarily the person that we are obeying is the position they hold. And we have to be careful how we speak about our government officials, because again, that's a position that they have for a time that is an important position. And so it's to show them honor and respect. And then also obedience. Obedience, something that we owe the government. In Romans 13, verse 1, it says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and authorities that exist are appointed by God. And so you have these governing authorities, and you see that it said that we need to be subject because, again, they're appointed, or that position is one that God has given for our good, for the good of for our good. And that's what, if you go back to Romans 13, and I kind of didn't talk much about verses 4, and actually, and so just read that verse again. Romans 13, verse 4 says, but it's God's minister to you for good. For you do evil, he will execute. If you do evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, and avenger, execute wrath, and practice evil. Notice twice in this fourth verse, we have the word minister there. That means servant. And that is that he is to serve. And how to do that? Well, he says one thing is that if you break the laws, that he is to execute wrath. That the government punishes the evildoer, the one who is the lawbreaker. And we understand that in the sense of it's necessary for us to have traffic laws. And if I disobey the traffic laws, then I will get caught and get a ticket, or may have my license taken away, or maybe even taken to jail. Kind of depends what I do with that, how I break the law. But if I am actually, and that's for everybody's benefit. It's good when the government locks up somebody that's a drunk driver, because that person is a danger to me. And so that's a good thing for me. It's good when the government arrests a murderer or a thief, because that person can steal from me or kill me. And so that's for my benefit. And so the government's protecting me in that sense there. And so he says that we are to understand that the government is to do good, is the role of government. And this does not necessarily apply to the individual, but to the importance of the government itself. And so 1 Peter 2, verse 13, and 1 Peter 2, verse 13 said, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. And so it's the thing about this, the government is doing something that is important here. And he mentions here for us the different levels of government. He talks about the king. He talks about the governors. He talks about those who are sent by him. And so those who are in lesser offices of government, or those who are acting on behalf of the government. And again, just think about the government. The government does things that are necessary. Think what it'd be like if all of a sudden the United States government collapsed. Not just for us, but for the whole world. And you think about the fact that if the government all of a sudden collapsed, what would be the difference here? What money would we use? How would we determine what the value of something is? How would we determine who actually owns something? That may just become like the law of might. Who had the biggest gun, or whoever had the most powerful weapons will own something. I can remember back in the days of 1970s when Shaw ran, and his government collapsed. And all of a sudden there was anarchy in that nation. Now, Iran up to that point had been a very prosperous nation because of oil and because of its ability that Shah Iran had offered. And it wasn't perfect. I'm not saying that. But all of a sudden everything was thrown into chaos. And just imagine what would happen if all of a sudden the total government of the United States just collapsed. And there would be who would pay the police officers? Who's going to pay for the garbage pickup? Who's going to pay for if a road repairs? And so all of a sudden those things here, we start realizing that the government provides a lot of things that we rely on and makes our life a lot better. And then the third thing is, so we need to also obey the government as far as that goes. And then also prayer. We need to pray for our officials. In 1 Timothy 2, verse 1, therefore exhort first of all thy supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving thanks be made for all men, for kings, for all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceful life in all goodness and reverence. Now this involves all those who are in authority. And the purpose is specifically here so that we as Christians can live in peace and quiet, that we can worship God without fear from outside forces, so that we do not have to fear somebody knocking on our door in the middle of the night, and to rest is because we're serving God, and that we simply can live our lives as Christians without fear of molestation. That really is what he's talking about here. And this may lead to a couple questions. It may lead to a question of, can I pray for this person? I look at this person, I don't like this person at all. I think he's detestable or she's detestable. Can I pray for this person? Can I pray for this leader when I do not agree with them? I do not agree with their policies. Maybe I like the person, I like their personality, but their policies I just find totally abhorrent. Can I pray for this person? Some things we can pray for is that they have a change of heart. I remember when Saddam Hussein of Iraq, before his death there, that the prayers many times said behalf the church I was assembling there, but one member in particular, that when he led a prayer, it was that this man's heart would be changed. And it always stuck with me that we may pray that this person may recognize who God is, may understand their accountability to God, may think about God's word and do that which is proper in God's sight. Those kind of things we could pray for. Now, on the other hand, render to God. What is it we think about that? Well, go back to Matthew 22 again, verse 21. They said to him, Caesar, and as whose image on the coin was Caesar's. And he said, then render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. And so the last thing is, what is it God is due? And when he says, render to God the things that are due him. And we say, well, allegiance. And by allegiance, I mean here the idea of putting him first. When you go back to Matthew 22, verse 36, in Matthew 22, verse 36, the question of which is the great commandment? In verse 37, Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Notice here what comes first. That is, God comes first. And that means he comes before our government. Our allegiance, first of all, as Christians, is to serve God. And we have the case over in the book of Acts, when Peter and John are arrested because of preaching the gospel. And they're arrested by actually by the Sanhedrin and the Jewish authorities. And in Acts 5th chapter, verse 27, it said, when they had brought them, talking about when the leading authorities of the Jews there brought them before them, is they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, I filled Jerusalem with their doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood on us. But Peter and the other apostles answered, said, we have to obey God rather than men. Now here we have a conflict, and the conflict is between the ordinance or the threats of the government here to these apostles, and that is, don't you go out there and preach anymore about Jesus. And what we see is that Peter says, okay, that we have to serve God first. God gets our allegiance above the government when there's a conflict. As Christians, we have to understand that really in our government, in our day and age, the conflict between us and the government is very rare. There are things the government does that I may not like. But as far as a direct conflict in our world today, as a person, as a citizen of the United States, we have very little conflict. We may sometimes read of a counselor, maybe a student at school puts their Bible on the desk, and the teacher comes and takes the Bible away from them or sends them to the principal office, and maybe they're expelled. That tends to be not necessarily a position by the government, but the individual using their position to do something. But for the most part, as Christians, we don't have to worry like in some parts of the world where if you're found with the Bible, you could be arrested. That if a group of people are found worshiping together, they may be thrown in prison and the key thrown away. Or in some parts of the world that if you talk about Jesus or if you start talking about the Bible, that you may be beheaded or you may be stoned. Now, we don't have that fear, not yet at least, in this country. And so for the most part, the conflict between us and our government is very rare. But the book of Revelation does show us the conflict between evil governments and God and what can happen and how brutal it can be. And so first of all, we have to make up our mind, no matter what the government may dictate to us, we're going to serve God. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is we have to have faith. We have to have faith in God. Over in Psalms 118, verse 8, it says, a better trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes, and that is in the leading authorities of princes right there. If you go to Psalms 146, verse 3, and start reading there, it says, do not put your trust in princes. Again, the same idea. Don't not put your trust in men. Well, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. There are certain things that individuals cannot do. That sometimes government policies or the whole government apparatus may stop an individual from doing something that's actually good. So don't put your trust in them. But he goes on and says, verse 4, his spirit departs, he returns to earth, and that very day his plans perish. And that is, somebody may have good ideas, and they may say, if I could be the president, if I could be the governor, if I could be, some position of authority, then I would all do this. And maybe we think, well, that'd be great. But that person may very well die tomorrow. All of a sudden, his plans come to nothing. A lot of times the government programs, you see, they're talking about 10, 20, 30 years from now. Well, that person's not going to be the president 10, 20, 30 years from now. That person's not going to have authority in the state government 10, 20, 30 years from now. They're going to most likely be dead. And so don't put your trust in them. And so what we have to, and over in Isaiah 31, verse 1, it says, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because there are many, and horsemen because they are very strong, but they do not look to the Lord, those coming to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. And that is with Judah. When they were being threatened by outside forces, what Judah a lot of times did was turn to other governments. Here he specifically says they would turn to Egypt and they seek relief from Egypt instead of turning to God. And so the question for us Christians, do we look to God for help, or do we look for political solutions? Do we look for God for help, or do we see what's popular? Do we look to God for help, or to see who's in power? And so we have to keep in mind here that we have to have faith in God. And then also we have to understand that Jesus had the opportunity to become a king. If he wanted to become a king, he had the opportunity to do that. In John 6 chapter, the people come to him willing to make him their king. And if you look, we find that Jesus rejected that. And when Jesus stood before Pilate, and Pilate asked the question, are you a king? In John 18, verse 36, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that it should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Jesus did not come to set up a political kingdom. He's not to come back to set up a political kingdom. Political powers will not solve all of our problems. It may help. There may be certain things that politics can solve, but as far as the problems we face as a nation, the moral dilemmas, the moral problems we have, that is not political solutions. And I've preached lessons earlier about what we need are change of heart. We need people to change their hearts and think more about their fellow man, and think more about God. The book of Revelation shows us a lot of the conflict between, I said earlier, evil governments and God. And the first part of Revelation, about chapter 1 through 11, is really between the church and the evil governments. And the latter part, it deals with kind of God against Satan, or Satan against God. In Revelation 13, verse 1, he said, then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 7 horns. And on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. They worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And I understand this is a lot of imagery here. It's describing as far as Satan and the evil governments that Satan is helping, and the conflict between, again, the government and God. But what we have to understand is nations can be like brute beasts. There are times we see nations acting with power and authority and doing terrible things. They can be like brute beasts. And as people, we have to ask ourselves, do we put our faith in the power of the government? That's what the temptation was during the time of Revelation. And that is, those who would bow down to the government, and those who would worship the government, or do we put our faith in God? And as Christians, we do not worship the government, but we worship God. And we worship the only God in heaven. And so as a Christian, I realize that presidents come and go, governors come and go, authorities come and go, but my God is the God of heaven. So let me leave you here with just a few points of application, the rest of yours. One thing is, as we see this election, keep things in perspective. Every 4 years, we hear the same thing, and that is, this is the most important election ever. Now, I'm not saying elections do not have consequences. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter who wins this election. But when I think back, I can remember, I'm old enough now, and I can tell you, I remember a little bit of the Goldwater against LBJ and Bird Johnson. And I can tell you that I remember Nixon against Humphrey, and I can remember Nixon against McGovern, and I can cite all of them up to the modern ones. And every 4 years, it is an important election. It's the most important election ever. Well, God's word is still true, and God still rules in heaven above no matter who wins this election. You have to keep that in perspective. Second is, beware of distractions. Our purpose as Christians is to follow Christ, to walk in the Spirit, to seek the kingdom of God first, to do what the Bible says. That is our first priority in life, and that's where we need to keep. And a lot of times people get so wrapped up in this time of year of the election, they forget that they're serving God. Third thing is, don't forget to submit and honor our government. On November 4th or 5th or 10th or whenever, we're going to have a new president. We'll have, or maybe the same president, who knows, but still honor the government in the sense of obeying the laws. Pray for our rulers. Pray for those who are in position of authority, that they will do good, that they will allow us to have peaceful lives, and trust in God and trust in God. Trust in God. Last passage I'll leave with you is over Daniel 4, chapter 34. And this deals with Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, if you read that passage there, that he's warned about his pride, and that Daniel tells him that he needs to humble himself for God. And Nebuchadnezzar does not do that. So basically, Nebuchadnezzar goes insane for a while. And he's out there eating grass and acting like a wild animal. And what verse 34 says, and at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lift up my eyes to heaven, and my understanding return to me. And I bless the Most High, and praise and honor him who lives forever. For his dominion is everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? Well, Nebuchadnezzar had to realize who God was, and he basically understand that God is the ruler. Even though Nebuchadnezzar may have been the king, God is the ruler. And we have to keep that in mind. God still rules. And so as we face this next few days, I just hope this lesson can perhaps put things in perspective to us and helps us to remember our role as Christians. I do appreciate you watching the program. And if you like it, hit the like button. If you feel that's worthy of sharing, feel free to share it. And I appreciate you watching. I hope you have a good week. And I hope to see you again sometime. Bye.